Welcome, guys. Thank you so much for joining us. Our first question is around brands and legitimacy. First question is, are public institutions actually brands in the same way that Apple or Nike are? Or is that the wrong way to think about these organizations like the NHS or the BBC?
Well, I don't think it's a wrong way of thinking about it. I think the answer is yes and no. So I think before we get into the detail of that, I think it's important to step back a little bit and understand what a brand is generally. So when we're thinking about brands, one of the things that comes to mind immediately are things like logos or colours or typographies or things that are visual and that you see all of the time.
Symbols.
Yeah, absolutely. And in many ways, it's the symbols we remember more than anything else. But behind those symbols and typographies, we see different things like performances or rituals or sets of values or ways in which staff are trained, different things that create cultures behind those visual identities. So brands, generally speaking, are kind of a collection of different thoughts and emotions and feelings that are associated with one particular organization.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, so Sammy brought up Nike, and so when you think of Nike, what do you think of as a brand? So it's got that iconic swoosh, right? But what else do you think of? You think of probably athletics, great athletes, performance, right? These are some of the common associations with the brand. So it's those brand associations that are really powerful.
Absolutely. I mean, we can think of it now more in terms of other commercial brands. The one that comes into my mind, perhaps Apple. So it's the minute you hear Apple or you see the Apple as a logo, you think of innovation and technology and being the pioneer in the domain. And it's like everyone loves Apple. I mean, I might be an exception. I don't do Apple. Nothing wrong with it. Just because emotionally, there's an element of an emotional attachment to the brand. I don't have that with Apple. I have that with Samsung. While we cannot deny the strength of Apple as a commercial brand.
And then going back to the question, which was about, well, are public institutions brands? And the answer is yes, they are. I mean, so think about we have some examples we're going to talk about today, right? Like the BBC, the post office is one. You've got the British Monarchy, the NHS. So a lot of different public institutions that are brands. They have the logos, the fonts, the colors, but they also have those associations, and people have experiences, right? And all of that feeds into the brand.
Absolutely. So if we want to go down the route now of sort of distinguishing a little bit between a commercial brand and a public sector brand, so there are quite few key characteristics. So one that jumped into my mind now is the fact that unlike commercial brands where what matters really, if we're going to be honest with each other, is things like competition and market share and all that, and profits. With a public sector brand, it's not really like that. While the symbolism is there, however, a key component and a key dimension of a public sector brand is the element of service. Why? Because with a commercial brand, the core of the brand essence could be perhaps a physical product that does the job and everyone loves it and likes it and everyone buys it. But with the public sector brand, service is so prominent. I mean, as an example, I can give the NHS. So even from the brand name, it's quite apparent. National Health Service. So there is the emphasis on a service, and more so there is an emphasis on a national service. So there is a greater purpose. There is that civic and national purpose that is very, very important, that you don't quite see as much within a commercial brand.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I can't think of, it's all services, isn't it? And of course there are commercial services as well, but I think when we're talking about public sector brands, they are almost exclusively services, right? And of course, there's, like you were saying, Yusra, a big difference there is also the service in terms of a public good, that it's serving the public, right, in some way. That yes, individual users have a certain amount of like customer satisfaction that they expect. But it has to be seen as more than just satisfying customers, right? But it's actually serving the greater good.
Absolutely. So in line with that element of public duty and public good and public service, and it's kind of all encompassing, for example, healthcare to all access, things like that. There is the notion of responsibility and social responsibility, because yes, some may argue that even with commercial brands, they try and do that as well. They try and have a layer of corporate social responsibility, but then they have other legs to stand on, actually, the product and all that. But with a public service sector brand, they don't have much to stand on. They have to have a strong social responsibility dimension into their communication and into their branding. So they should pretty much sort of represent something greater than themselves. So the expectation level in terms of values and social responsibility is a lot greater with a public service sector brand.
Yeah.
Thank you guys for those detailed answers. Shall we move on to the next question?
Sure.
Should public institutions even think of themselves as marketing anything, or does that language sit uneasily with ideas of public service and neutrality?
There's a long history with the public sector and questions over what, how, and when they should be marketing. So we think of marketing conceptually as quite a commercial activity. And as we've just discussed, we see public service as much less commercially focused. So the NHS doesn't go around and vaccinate people because it's good business sense. It does it because it's socially responsible to do so. We don't want people ill, so they go and vaccinate. In the same way that it may not be cost effective to run certain train services. So we determine, that the public sector determines that it is beneficial to run services to certain places because we want the whole country connected. And actually, if you go back to the Second World War, when we had a massive boost to the public sector, so we had a number of industries nationalised, so we're thinking particularly utility industries, so we're thinking like gas, coal, but also railways. In that instance, we also had a nationalised airline. And we don't traditionally think of them as natural marketers. But actually, I'm getting tied up in that.
Well, actually,
hold on. You said we don't think of them as natural marketers, but what?
Because we don't think of them as natural marketers because we don't necessarily see their activities as we don't necessarily see them in a competitive sense, right? So houses needed supplying with coal to keep warm. They needed energy, they needed electricity, people needed to get on trains.
But that also includes, I think we have a little bit of a misconception over what is marketing, right? And we tend to equate it with advertising, right? And advertising can be a part of marketing, but marketing like really encompasses everything that means bringing the services like to the market, to the people. So in that sense, there has to be marketing. There has to be an amount of public awareness and public ability to interface, right? So that's where the marketing aspect for public sector brands come in.
And interesting, one of the key bodies, if we're thinking about it historically, one of the key bodies that doesn't understand that function of marketing is actually a number of governments who don't understand that these public sector organisations need to be spending money on marketing day to day because they need to be acting and reacting to their consumers. You get a number of reports in the 60s, 70s and 80s that basically question the role of specifically advertising, but also other elements of marketing. And all of those reports conclude that they should be spending money on this practice because it's beneficial for them to compete in the same economy as the private sector.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and that reminds me of, it wasn't that long ago either, the kind of, I don't know if it rose to the level of a scandal, but there was certainly a furor over the gov.uk rebranding. So if you're not aware of this, it was very publicly declared that it cost something like £500,000 to what they said essentially make the dot in gov.uk just turquoise and raise it up a little bit. And there were a number of designers, like professional designers, who actually came to the defense of this move. And they're saying, well, no, it wasn't just about moving the dot in gov.uk. It had to do with changing the actual interface of how people interact with the services in terms of reaching these services online, on their phones, making them more user-friendly. And yes, there were logo changes that went along with it, but that was actually quite a small aspect of it. And getting back to this point of governments not understanding how important marketing is, some designers tried to make a freedom of information request. Like, we would like to see all of the documents around the process of the rebranding. I mean, they were genuinely interested, but the ministers refused to release these documents. And
Very
it was that
interesting.
refusal that was more damaging than just the cost of the rebrand itself. If they had simply released it, it actually would have helped make their case. Like, no, this was really value for money that we did here, and it was an essential way to improve, again, the service that we provide. So that speaks to the continued misunderstanding of what is marketing today.
And that brings us to perhaps one point of marketing promotion doesn't necessarily have to be active from the institution itself. I mean, we have the media and publicity, and sometimes they do the promotion for you, hopefully in a positive light, but sometimes there is negative publicity around a particular service or an institution. So let's think of marketing in a wholesome way, including PR, including publicity, rather than the active efforts of the institution to promote itself and its brand.
I think that also ties into one of the other big, I don't know whether issues is the right thing to tag it with, but because the public sector is inherently owned by everyone. So everyone that pays taxes contributes to the public sector, and by definition, how it markets, how it brands. And it all comes back to accountability. So funny, I did have that figure actually. So they spent the headline was £532,000 to move a dot.
Yeah.
But the number of examples of this. So the rebranding of the overground lines cost £6.3 million. The London 2012 logo cost 400,000. BBC spent 1.3 million rebranding in the 1990s. It's easy to highlight these as big expenses. And it's not always immediately obvious in the public sector what the value of doing that is. But as we say, it's not just changing colours or adding different names. It's building a professional, reputable, shall we say, legitimate face and mechanism behind those names that helps to generate an efficient, legitimate public sector.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Lovely. Perfect. Okay, great segue there, Mr. Dr. Lewis Smith. Great segue.
I'm just making it up as I go along.
I'll keep that in, by the way. So, my next question is, and this could be for you, Jessica, actually.
Sure.
Is legitimacy something public institutions automatically possess by virtue of law and democracy? Or is it something that it must be continuously earned?
Oh, that's a good question. I think frustratingly, my answer is going to again be, well, yes and no. Yes, in the sense that the law and democracy, like by virtue of being a public sector brand, then it has the kind of you could say the branding baggage, if you will, of the government, but that also instantly lends it credibility, right? So there is something to that, yes. However, legitimacy is really built over time, over a history of events. And, keep in mind what legitimacy is, right? Legitimacy basically means that the public at large accepts that this individual or organization is complying with social norms and values, right? And every brand needs to be seen as legitimate. Certainly commercial brands do. It's just that public sector brands, the bar for legitimacy is so much higher, right? Because again, as you mentioned earlier, they have to be seen as contributing positively to society. Yeah.
I like that. What do you think about that, Lewis?
Oh God! So it wouldn't come to me.
What do you think about that?
Why me?
It's a great question.
Come on, guys.
I have a question.
Sure.
And I think it's for all of you. Has there been a case where a public institution backed by government, which automatically gives it credibility, was not credible, even if the government joined it? Has there been
Do we
a case?
have any? So, Lewis, you're the history guy.
Has there been a case like
Do
that?
we have any? I think the best we can think of is, does it count when a public brand or company becomes privatized? I don't know if that counts.
I don't know. I was thinking about that when an organisation is privatised, does it lose legitimacy? If I interpret that question, if I interpret what's the question being asked, I would. It's too complicated a question.
I think the short answer is no. To begin
I
with.
would agree. Yeah.
But no, there has been no public institution brand that has completely lost its legitimacy, despite having the official government kind of blessing, I suppose, for lack of a better word. Although this might be a good time to bring up a possible future scenario about a very beloved British institution
Okay.
whose future might be uncertain,
Okay.
which is the British monarchy.
Oh, very good example.
So
Yeah.
I was checking this today, in preparation. So according to a pretty recent, I think from January YouGov poll, the royal family and the British monarchy as an institution is still pretty popular. I think 59% of the British population, feels positively, right? But as we know, there's been a series of scandals. And what we know about legitimacy is, going back to that question, is that it's based on history of events. Now, of course, the British monarchy has a long, long, long history. So even these very recent scandals aren't going to delegitimize, right? But the issue that we're facing here is what's going to happen in 20 years or so when you have an increasing number of younger generations that don't have the same perceptions of the British monarchy as we do today, right?
Yes, and that perhaps brings us to sometimes in the specific context of a public sector institution, and here let's talk about the monarchy, because there is an element of almost stability and permanence that is not really akin to a commercial brand. A commercial brand can be doing very well today, gone tomorrow. But with a public institution, this permanence gives it a little bit of a protection. However, we can't deny the fact that a public institution, because they tend to be generally old school, rooted with a strong brand heritage, they need still to have some sort of rebranding and reforms to become more relevant to the newer generation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Relevance. That's the key. I think if the British monarchy is going to maintain its legitimacy, and it has a lot going for it, but it has to be seen as relevant, and it has to be seen as, despite whatever it costs or whatever funds it brings in, wherever it lands. In that regard, it has to be seen as providing value, right? And there is a narrative, there is a discourse questioning the value. Now, again, like I said, it's not at the point of an existential point right now, but I'm just wondering what will happen in the future.
Yeah.
Interestingly, on that point, one thing that's certainly been happening more, especially when we're talking about the role of the monarchy, particularly as a public sector role, one with like national importance, I think is the use of the monarchy politically, not necessarily to enact political goals, but so the invitation from King Charles to Donald Trump was nothing but an act of clearly trying to. I don't know if I'm going too off topic there, but it was essentially a move designed to curry favour with the United States, which as a nation really does like the British monarchy as kind of a centre of drama or indeed tourist attraction. And I perhaps wondered whether that might also protect it in the future.
The political relevance of the monarchy. Yeah. It could. I don't think it's a done deal. I don't think it's something that for sure is going to happen. But what we have to see is, well, what do they do? How do they establish continued relevance? I think that's the key thing to see.
Yeah.
So when scandals erupt, like the ongoing Epstein file revelations touching political and royal circles, what happens to the brand of public institution? Can legitimacy survive reputational shocks like these?
Wow, what a great example that Jessica led nicely to it. So, yes, we cannot deny. I mean, it's been plastered all over the news recently for a number of weeks and even months. Yes, the British monarchy is in crisis indeed. I've just taken it as one illustration of a public sector brand in a crisis. So what tends to happen usually is that with a crisis like this pertaining to an important and a crucial public sector brand, the public tends to be a little bit more sort of unforgiving, let's say, because naturally within such public sector brand, the expectations are a lot higher in terms of leading by example, duty of care, public duty, public service, high level of expectations in terms of values to be upheld. So when something like that happens and is heavily mediatized, naturally there would be some level of reputational damage, whether we want it or not. And that has got a knock-on effect on the trust being an important dimension of a public sector institution, of a brand. So when some level of trust is eroded, then we're kind of touching a little bit on the legitimacy realm. Because why the public tends to be more unforgiving when it comes to such institution or brand is that we don't have much choice. Like, for example, if a supermarket, you're disappointed with it, a supermarket brand, you go and jump ship, you go to another brand. Yes, you can complain, there might be some service recovery of that commercial brand, but you forget about it. But when something like that happens with a public sector brand, you cannot just switch governance or institution, because there are legal and taxation systems and policies that you have to abide by. So there is less choice. So the faith, when it's broken, it naturally has got a bigger sort of impact on the public rather than when it comes to a commercial brand.
Yeah, and you see how, like, when a scandal like that hits, the public institution has to act decisively and quickly to minimize damage. So we saw that Prince Andrew is no longer a prince, right? And then in terms of the government, Mandelson is now out, right? So we see that what happens here, because this was a crisis of values. You know, we talked about how legitimacy means being seen as adhering to these high standards, to these values, and so that Epstein scandal is very much about values, and that's a little bit different from other kinds of crises that are more about, say, fundamental problems with the service. Right, the services that we're expecting, say with the HMRC or the NHS, with those types of, I don't know if they rise to the level of scandal, but it's certainly a high degree of dissatisfaction. But what you see is that the public still very much believes in the core principles of the NHS. Everybody wants the NHS. Everybody wants, well, nearly everybody wants the NHS to work. But what they want is for the government to fix things, like fix this mess, right? So it's a little bit different how the crisis plays out.
Absolutely, yeah. And you brought up an important point in a sense that if a commercial brand fails, that's just one incident, one brand. If the public institution fails, we blame it on the politics and the government.
Right.
So there is that political signaling that we cannot really detach from public sector brand and political signaling and governance. Those two are kind of seismic twins almost.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Another thing perhaps that I might want to add with regards to the specifics of scandals, crises, and a public sector brand is the issue. Is quite a self-explanatory issue of financial responsibility, because obviously with the public sector, it's tax-funded money, taxpayers' money. So when things go wrong and when there is a crisis or a scandal, we're a bit more worked up as a public because, by the way, we gave you money. It's our collective resources. And that pretty much is illustrated in the current scandal allegation around public office misuse. Misuse of public office. Yeah, absolutely.
Perfect.
There was something I wanted to add. It's completely gone, but I'd like to try anyway.
Go for it.
So we were talking about... See, I think this is why the issues that the monarchy are facing are so interesting. Because if you think about the complaints levied against the NHS, or indeed even if we're thinking like nationalised rail operators, as there are still a few in the UK, if we think about the problems they face, it's still there's still a basic level of functionality. Like, you can still go to hospital, you still get treated. It takes longer. The fundamental, I think the word you use, value, is still there. But when you think about if you think about the monarchy, there isn't really a ground level of function. There's no demonstrable kind of service per se, and it's much harder.
It's intangible, isn't it? There is, because it's kind of a diffuse representation, right? That the monarchy provides.
Yeah.
I mean, and that gets symbolized into or not symbolized, but it gets crystallized into certain like ceremonial moments that we see. But you're right, Lewis. It's very what the monarchy does is quite distinct from other types of public brands.
And dare we also add that the monarchy is perhaps, but that's just an unusual way of thinking about it, but the monarchy is quite small because the public faces of the monarchy are a handful of quite wealthy, quite entitled individuals that live in extremely expensive areas in central London. Whereas if you think about the NHS, we conceptualise the NHS as doctors and nurses, of which there are many, and of which are delivering this much more tangible value. So perhaps that's another one of the royal family's struggles, is that actually it's almost positioned incorrectly.
I think with monarchies, the key characteristic of a monarchy, well, here again, some countries more than others, there is that symbolism. It's a bit more of a deeper and deeply rooted symbolism of stability. Again, some countries more than others. So there is that essence of continuity and stability, and we're doing fine. Yes, we have problems here and there like any other countries, but at least it gives you that abstract level of ideally political stabilities that maybe some other countries may not have, although that's debatable, of course.
Yeah, that is kind of like that gets encapsulated in the saying, the king is dead, long live the king.
Absolutely.
Right, and even this current YouGov poll, there were two. I don't know how to put it, two entities that were being that people were asked about. One was the royal family, and then the other was the British monarchy, right? So
Interesting.
yeah,
Very interesting.
remembering that there is the current makeup of the royal family, which is obviously going to change over time, but then there's the institution of the monarchy, right? And I think really maybe and then of course the individuals, royal family individuals also have their own brands.
Absolutely.
Right? So exactly. So it gets a little blurred, it gets a little murky there, but probably for our purposes, it's most useful to think about the British monarchy as an institution, right? Rather than the family, the royal family, or individuals.
Yeah.
Lovely. Great segue, by the way, because my next question is, public institutions often rely on powerful symbols like national identity, tradition, public service. But when trust starts eroding, do these symbols still work, or do people start seeing them as empty narratives?
No. I think I can no equivocal answers here. I think I'm going to say no to that. It is interesting, though, about national symbols that are then tied to public sector brands. The symbols themselves are very rich. They have layered meanings. They're very powerful. I would actually say they kind of outlast any particular institution, certainly any particular incident that happens. Symbols have a way of even anchoring a public sector institution to really lend, at least temporarily, the aura of legitimacy certainly in times of crisis. All right, so if you think about these national symbols, what are they? They, what do they evoke? They evoke history, tradition, values, these things that we hang on to as what endures, right? And it's that endurance that also gives us hope for the future, right? Because it's this idea of whatever else is going on in the world, I know this, and I know that this is continuing, and it will continue, right? So now, not everyone has the same exact associations with these different national symbols. For some people, they can have quite negative associations with these symbols. But that's actually that isn't what's important, because remember we said legitimacy is acceptance by public at large, right? It's what British society as a whole decides, right? Not any particular subgroup. Yeah.
Do you know, one of the examples that comes to mind when you were talking was British Airways. And we think, well, British Airways is a private airline, right? It's not a public it's not a public sector organisation at all. But actually, it was a public sector organisation, and it was privatised in the 1980s. But I think what you see in British Airways' transition from public sector to private sector is that it carries forward a lot of those values, and it builds its legitimacy based on its past. So very relatively recently, British Airways celebrated its 100th birthday. So the fact that the airline has been going for 100 years suggests reliability, suggests trust, it suggests legitimacy. And I had other things I wanted to say, and I've gone.
Well, actually, British Airways is super interesting because, okay, like you said, it's one of those funny, I would say it's a little bit like liminal, if I can use that word, meaning it kind of sits between, even though, like you said, it is technically a private company, but the associations, right? We still, I don't know, have a very strong aura of public sector, right, with British Airways. So it is an interesting one, and it does have, it's an interesting case too, speaking of legitimacy, because at the same time that it is highly trusted, it's a premium airline, but it also has recently very low customer satisfaction, like very, very low. And then there was, they made those changes to their loyalty program that many people were not happy with, because it basically ended up losing status, right? So even though, so what we have to see is, okay, it's kind of hit a low point in terms of public perception. People aren't happy with the loyalty scheme. Yet it does have a strong reserve of legitimacy. So how do they build that back up?
Yeah. I mean, talking about British Airways, I remember that was 20 years ago when I first came to this country, and I took a British Airways flight from Casablanca to London. And the moment I am in the plane, British Airways, I had a taste of Britishness before getting into the UK. And now reflecting back, after obviously doing studies in branding and all that, I think the brand name plays a big role because it's called British Airways. So naturally there is that national, almost civic narrative within the brand name that gives us this connotation of Britishness and may lead us a little bit to the public arena. I'm sure, I mean, they should definitely keep this name. If they change the name to something else, non-British, I think because now it's the Britishness of the brand that kind of gives them a little bit of a push despite the low
it's
rate.
An aura.
It's an aura. I think it would be a terrible idea to change the brand name. I'm not saying they are considering it, I don't know, but the Britishness within the brand name sustain them, definitely.
But it's interesting you should say that, because I don't think they could change their brand name. I think there's so much built around the name British Airways.
Oh, it'd be catastrophic.
Not even for like financial terms. Okay, you could do it, but it would cost a lot of money. But symbolically, the change from British Airways to something else, which I'm sure would still consist of the words British and something aviation related, because it's an airline. But the loss of that name, I think, would be crippling. And I think that would play a lot into the ultimate outcome of the airline.
Think of, there's another example, since we're talking about former public institutions that were privatized. Royal Mail is another one of these that is actually privatized. It's a private company, but they are really hanging on to the name, to all of the Britishness that is encapsulated in not just the name Royal Mail, but also the logo. The logo includes the crown. Right? So, and then interestingly, so that's a private company. The post office is public, and it's got this very modern, very, red oval with a very plain, I don't know, what do you call it? Is it kind of a sans serif type of font? Just very like modern, clean, straightforward post office. That's it. There's no crown. There's no shield. There's no, and they are different services, and one is public and one is private, and it's not the ones that you would guess by looking at it.
Interesting.
Amazing. Well, great conversations around brand, public institutions, private institutions. Any final remarks? Any final thoughts you want to share with everybody before we close off?
That's a great question.
Shall we talk about rebranding and reforms? Which we kind of touched on a little bit when we talked about the British Airways. I think as any brand, now coming back to the first question, are public institution brands? Yes, they are definitely. And they have room and space for branding strategies, but also for rebranding strategies when things go wrong. So when things go wrong within a public brand, same way as a commercial brand, there should be some rebranding. So in a public setting, we talk about reforms. When there is a crisis or when there is perhaps disappointment of the public when it comes to public sector brand performance, then the issue here comes, or how do we reform? So a key element is accountability. That ties in very nicely to legitimacy. Yes, things went wrong. We own up to it as an institution. This is our plan of reform, and deliver on the reform or rebrand promise, definitely.
Yeah, and rebranding, as we were talking about with the Monarchy, rebranding has to do with continued relevance. You know, continuing to deliver value, to be, efficient and provide, the services that they're supposed to provide. I think, though, and I think this is from you, Yusra, you can expand on this if you want, but when we were talking a little bit earlier, you had this almost throwaway line that was something like, we have to let public sector brands to compete in the economies that they're in, not the economies we want to be in.
I think that was Lewis,
I think it
wasn't
was, yeah.
Oh, sorry, Yusra. Okay, Lewis.
You can take it if you like.
Go ahead. Go
Should
ahead.
I restate that? No. Well, I thought, because I was thinking about that, I was like, that is absolutely right. I think that is actually a really profound point, to be honest, because when we think about continued relevance and we think about these things that that we need these public institutions and services to provide for us, and sometimes there's a little bit of like wishful thinking around what should happen or where we should be versus what we actually have.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, that is one of the big problems that nationalised industry faced back in the 60s and 70s, because there were people that are under the impression that these organisations are monopolies, that there are no other organisations that they're competing with. But that's wrong. They have to compete. So, for example, travel. Railways had to compete with airlines, had to compete with coach companies, which is a mix of public and private sector all at once.
But not all of them compete. There's no competitor for HMRC.
Well, yes, that's true. That is very true. Perhaps to play devil's advocate, I could perhaps argue that there is, because people invest in tax systems abroad. Whether the legitimacy of actually doing that is a different question, but
yeah, I don't know. Plus, the legality might be dubious.
Yeah, I think a very important point here that perhaps we've missed throughout this conversation, which separates or distinguishes public sector brands, is this issue of authority, which kind of takes away a little bit from competition. Like, we have to pay our taxes. So with HMRC, there is the element of power exercised on the public that may not perhaps be the same at all with a commercial brand. I mean, if I don't want to buy Nike, nobody can force me to, but I have to adhere to the HMRC taxes system, etc., etc. Yeah.
Just to go back on, just to try and save myself from shooting myself in the foot there. I think if we want the idea that we have to remember that the public sector institutions we have today compete in the economy we have today.
Yes.
And therefore, the economy we have today builds legitimacy in part through branding and marketing. So we can't turn around and... So this may be worth cutting or it may not be. So I'm very left-wing. I don't really care for capitalism in general. I actually probably should cut that if I'm a member of business school.
I don't know. There's
Scrap that.
at Leicester, they're very anti-capitalist.
Yeah.
The marketing
That's
department.
interesting.
I
That's
mean,
very
universities tend to be left
Yeah.
in any way,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
you should
Everybody's
be fine.
left-wing.
Yeah.
I'm neutral, but I can tell you all left-wing.
What about we
Super
say
left-wing.
like super strong welfare state? That's what.
Yeah.
there you
Yeah.
go, there you go.
That's what
Yeah.
we like.
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if we're building, if governments are building economic mechanisms that even that's crap. Come on, Lewis.
Okay, while you are gathering your thoughts, I think kind of talking about what you were saying about. I take your point. You do. I was kind of like teasing you a little bit there, like there's no competitor for HMRC. But actually, what happens when the government, by way of the HMRC, introduces new tax regulations, and then suddenly you have a bunch of wealthy people deciding they're not going to spend as much money in the UK as they used to. So talk about voting with your feet. And then again, there's, I was thinking, going back to this idea of, well, we're in the economy that we're in, not the one that we want to be. And you think of, okay, the Bank of England. Right, and what does the Bank of England do? It sets the base rate, and it's responsible for, has quite a lot of power, right, in terms of setting the underlying, fundamentals for the economy, but in response to macro environmental geopolitical circumstances. So when the public views the Bank of England as, well, their primary job is to fight inflation, right? Their goal is to keep inflation at 2%, which, but the Bank of England can't wave a magic wand and say, okay, hey presto, this is where we are, 2% inflation. It can only pull the levers that it has access to, right, to negotiate the environment that we're in. Does that help?
I think so. Just steal the example I've got here.
You need to save yourself.
I do, don't I? Yeah, that's right. This has got to go well. So I think we see this in the modern rebranding of Great British Railways. So there's been a number of train operating companies that have been taken under by the state, and the Department of Transport has been building a collective brand. So we knew it back in the 1970s as British Rail. But the new brand now is Great British Rail. And they spent, there was a Freedom of Information request, and they spent £32,400 on rebranding.
32,000.
Yeah.
That's not much.
Precisely. Nonetheless, it still makes the rounds in the press to say
Right.
£32,000 of your hard-earned taxpayer money. But again, we need to remember that these organisations are competing in today's economy, not in the 1970s economy.
Yeah.
And if we were to prevent a modern, efficient railway from building a modern, efficient brand, keeping in mind that modern and efficient mean different things at different points in time, then people will stop seeing it as a modern and efficient railway. So we need to allow public sector organisations like these to undertake these branding exercises so that they are competing in the economy.
Yeah. I think it also goes back to the issue of transparency and accountability. I think it's fine to spend $32,000 on a rebrand, which, again, keeping in mind what that has to do with. It's not just colors and logos, right? It has to do with like fundamental aspects of the service, of the app that you're going to use to book your tickets. You want all of these things to work. Where, again, it's not Fantasyland, so some money has to be spent, and that's why it was a big mistake for those ministers to not release the information about, well, what was the rebranding process for gov.uk. It would have been actually enormously beneficial to show, like, this is everything that went into it. But by trying to hide that information, then you're not being transparent, you're not being accountable, and it looks like you have something to hide.
Right. Yeah.
Amazing. And we'll leave it there. If anyone's interested in hearing our amazing professors talk more about branding, maybe in a private sector, maybe somewhere else, we can bring him again for part 2. But for today, this is it. Guys, any final words for everybody?
Have a great day.
Perfect.
Learn about branding.
Absolutely.
Come to Brunel.
It's fabulous. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much, guys. This has been very, very beneficial, even for me, someone behind the scene. I'm pretty sure for our listeners as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you. Thank you.
Oh my goodness.